Welcome to the Science for Sport podcast, where we dive into stories and insights that drive peak performance. Join us as we uncover the secrets behind the science of success. Here's your host, Richard Graves.
Hello and welcome to the Science for Sport podcast with me, Richard Graves. This week, we're looking at coaching. What is it that makes a good coach? How important is it to utilise technology correctly in your coaching methods? And just what kind of influence can good communication have in helping athletes realise their true potential? This week's guest is Jeff Reinebold, an American football coach in a career that spans over 5 decades. He's coached in the United States, in Canada and Europe, and also in the NFL alongside some of the biggest names ever to have coached in the sport. He's still going strong as the defensive line coach at the University of Hawaii, so let's hear from him now.
Unlocking sports science to push the limits of human potential. This is the Science for Sport podcast.
Well, Jeff, I know you're joining us from Hawaii as we record this. You're fresh off the practice field at the crack of dawn over there. Look, for those that aren't aware of your story, a coaching career that is now spanning into its 5th decade. You've coached on both sides of the pond over in Europe and America. Like I say, for those that aren't familiar with your story, give them a brief resume.
Well, I was, a kid that grew up a coach's kid. My father was in professional baseball, and I was that laid a pattern. I think if I was an amateur psychologist, I would say that I chose football because baseball was my dad's sport, and I wanted to have my own, and I think, but yet honor him and follow in his footsteps. It's been an incredible run, an incredible ride. And, I'm at the point now where I can see the end. I can see the finish line. But certainly, when you're running this race, you keep sprinting until you get to the finish line. You don't coast in. So it's been incredible. I've met so many amazing people and been able to do so many things. Sometimes, I'll be honest with you, Richard, I pinch myself and think, how did a kid with no more talent, no more intelligence, and no more pedigree than me get to do all these things? And I think it's just because of the touch of a lot of people along that path. And, again, football, I think about this, and it's not being dramatic when I say this, football has given me just about every good thing in my life. And our friendship is one of those things, the fact that we met when we both worked at Sky, and, our love of the game and broadcasting Super Bowls together and all of that. So, it's been a long journey, but it's been a fun ride. And I still got a little juice left in me. So I'm going to squeeze it till it's all gone.
Absolutely. Like you say, many people, certainly in the UK, will know you from your work with Sky Sports, covering the National Football League. On the other side of the pond, of course, it's your work in college football. You're with the University of Hawaii at the moment, but you've had great success in the Canadian Football League as well. You did a spell with the European League, the European arm of the NFL in the 80s and 90s. So where does that drive, that desire, that love of the game that is clearly still within you come from it, and what is it that keeps you going?
It's funny, Rich. I fell in love with the game as a little kid, right? I mean, I'll be honest with you. My mom and dad moved back to South Bend, Indiana, so that my mom could have her parents close to her, because my dad was constantly on the road, and we had 5 kids and she needed help. And we happened to move into a little house, with 2-bedroom house with 5 kids that was so close to Notre Dame Stadium that on Saturdays you could hear the crowd roar and you could hear the band play and all of that. And so that really initiated my love of football. And, then I sold programs at the game at Notre Dame Stadium as a 7th grader and snuck in to watch the games. And I just became enraptured with football, and knew that at some point, that I wanted to do it as professionally. I wasn't good enough player to have that opportunity, but was able to, my last year of playing, remember Jack Bicknell, who was the head coach of the Scottish Claymores and Barcelona Dragons in NFL Europe, was my college coach, and he called me into his office about midway through my senior year, and he said, "What are you going to do when this is over?" I said, "What? It's over? What are you talking about?" I just said, you lived in fantasy land. You thought you were going to play forever, but you find out that it does come to an end. The playing side comes to an end for everybody, and he was the first one that told me. He said, "I think you should coach. I think you do a good job with that." And that started me on this journey, and I still love the game. I still can't get enough of it. And, the broadcasting thing happened purely by chance, and I've not trained that way. It just, it was an opportunity that came, and it's been, 15 years now at Sky, 18 years at Sky, or whatever it's been. And I'm really blessed and fortunate to have had all the experiences I've had.
Of course, people that see you in broadcasting roles will see all the technology and the different ways of bringing the action and breaking down plays into the living rooms of the viewers. But when you look back, go all the way back to the early 80s when it started, that technology wasn't the same. It certainly wasn't there at everybody's disposal as it is now. How have things changed from when you started to how it's evolved right now?
Well, I think, really the technology boom has really been unbelievable. I mean, when I think about when we started, as a high school kid, you didn't film your practices. You got your game film, but you never filmed your practices. Now, even the lowest levels of amateur football, with a cell phone, you can go out and film practice. So kids are inundated with information now that we weren't. And then as coaches, again, one of the first recollections I have of coaching was, the film was shot in 16 millimeter. And so you'd have to send the film away, you get it back, and then you make cut-ups to help the athletes, learn situational football or a technique or whatever. And you'd have to cut out this length of film, hang it on your wall, and then they had a little thing called a guillotine splicer where you'd put it together, and you actually made your own films. And so these kids today, these young coaches today, they come in here and you get on the computer 15 minutes after practice and everything's in the computer, and you can sort it in any number of ways you can sort it. So the players, the biggest difference to me with the technology is the players have access to more ways to get better, more ways to learn, more ways to understand the game that we ever did. We were all, learners by our playbook, right? Well, playbooks are really kind of passé now. And typically they come in the form of a MacBook or a computer with all the information inside it, and then you access it. So you sit in a meeting now, and back in the day, guys used to come in with a paper and a pen, or a notebook and a pen, and their their 500-page playbook. Now they come in with their laptop, and they set their laptop down, open the top of their laptop, and let's say, "Okay, coach, let's have a meeting." So it is really, really changed. It has changed a great deal, and I think it's really changed for the better.
Of course, it's great to have this wealth of technology at the disposal of young up-and-coming athletes today, but I guess it only makes them a better player if they utilize it in the right way, the right fashion, doesn't it?
Yeah, and the same thing's true for coaches. I know Catapult was sponsor this podcast, and they have revolutionized the way we as coaches get information on our athletes. Whether you're overworking them, underworking them, whether what their heart rate is during practice, all things that as a young coach you learn to kind of get a visual for. Well, now you have hard numbers at your fingertips during the course of a practice. So if you feel like a guy, if your guy's run too much, or he's, hasn't run enough or whatever, it's really a benefit for the athlete and for the coach, because it allows you to manage their load better. And, one of the hardest things you have to learn in this business is more oftentimes isn't better. And, that's where people like Catapult that have come into the business have really, really changed the physiology of sport.
Well, I'm glad you've brought up this topic, because on previous editions of this podcast, it's a debate that we've had. Old school techniques where you wouldn't necessarily have access to technology. It would be about fitness, getting back in shape, and being able to go out there and take it onto the field, against modern day tech that, like you say, measures workload, measures heart rate, tells you whether a player's reaching a finite limit and getting close to injury. There's arguments on both sides of the coin that I've heard. Old school techniques make players more robust. Modern techniques make players much fitter, but take them to the limit maybe. You've experienced this throughout the course of your career. You've coached during the transition. You've seen technology come and help you. Where do you sit on this?
Well, I'm a big proponent of technology, and I'll tell you why. I went through a really tough experience for all of us that were at the University of New Mexico, and I think it was 1989 or 1990. We actually had a player in a summer conditioning test die on the field of a heart attack. And I think now about that young man, and had we had the technology that's available to coaches and trainers today, if he might not still be with us, if there might not have been an opportunity for us to recognize that he was in trouble and needed medical attention before he fell over and passed away on the field. So because of that incident, I have always been a proponent of trying to be on the cutting edge of what technology can do for us to help us condition the athletes. Again, it's a really scary thing to me when I watch strength coaches and conditioning guys and everybody that's coaching, pushing kids, and I think there is a place for that. You gotta take them, to past their, as Coach Vermeil used to call them, their self-imposed limitations. But again, you've got to also have the technology on your hands at your hands, so that if you push them too far, you can reel them back in before you do damage to the athlete. And I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, for sure. And from your perspective, in terms of being a coach, I guess when you're faced with an incident of that nature, the adversity that naturally comes with it, not just for you as a coach and the staff, but obviously the players, teammates as well. How do you handle that? And is it in times such as those when you find out more about yourself?
Yeah, I think there's no question about that. And it does, when you go through a traumatic experience like that in a team environment, it makes you question a lot of things. You question your modality, you question, I think the athletes certainly begin to question, the leadership of the coaching staff and the training staff and the equipment, the strength staff. And, again, I think if you take your ego out of it, and this is really hard to do, but if you take your ego and your personal feelings out of it, you can see it as a tremendous lesson that everybody can learn about, just how fragile this whole thing really is. Athletes are not, bulletproof. And, I think it's a really, really slippery slope when you start pushing guys well beyond what their, what their self-imposed limitations are. Now, obviously, I go back to, you always revert back to when you played and the things that you did. And like some of the things that we did back in those days, frankly, were barbaric. You would never even be allowed to, you couldn't even do them today, right? It was a different time. And I'm not critical of the guys that, put us through those environments. It's just that's the best that they knew, right? And they did what they knew. And so, it's like, can you compare, was Roger Staubach better than Troy Aikman? Well, they played in different eras. So, you love the greatness of the player and don't try and, you can't compare eras, right? So I'm really glad that I've been able to last long enough to see this new era where there's more science involved in the game. There's more, technology involved in the game. The game is still a beautiful game. The game is still a physical game. It's still, truly a man's game. It is all that made me fall in love with football, but it's also much safer than it's ever been.
Yeah, and that's critical, isn't it? In a modern era when we see athletes getting fitter, getting quicker, the contact becomes a lot harder as well, and we see a greater emphasis not just across college football but the NFL and all sports, rugby amongst them, looking to make the game safer for the participants. And I imagine one thing that helps you as a coach as well in this era when the world is a much smaller place because of technology is that you have the opportunity to learn from research and learn from what other sports discover as well, and then apply it to some of your coaching methods.
No question, Richard. And I think too that for coaches, it's it's funny because I think back about how we learned, right, as coaches. Well, you learn from talking to other coaches, and that was typically done, at a convention or a clinic, or two guys sitting in a pub, and you pull out a napkin and you say, well, you diagram a play and say, what do you think of this? And he diagrams you exchange ideas. Well, that's still done now, except the information exchange is much more rapid, and it doesn't require you to actually be with somebody, right? So for example, I do an awful lot of things every year with young guys that want to get started in the business. And that's kind of payback for the guys that got me going in the business. And, that's one of the things that Coach Vermeil talked about. I tell you, I had a great experience with him. He is probably, next to my dad, maybe the most influential male figure in my life. And I brought him out. I was head coach of a little tiny school, and I brought him out, and he spent a week with us. And as he's getting on the plane to go back to Philadelphia, he said to me, I'm going to send you something that means more will mean more to you than it does to me. It's time for me to pass it on. And I had no idea what he was talking about. But about a week later, the post office at the university called, and they said, hey, there's a box for you here. And I said, well, would you ask the student delivery guy to bring it down? He said, no, it's too big. We can't. You're gonna have to bring a cart. And so I got a cart, and I went down there, and I'm thinking, what in the world is this? And it was a big box. It was about a 4x4 box, and it was from Coach Vermeil. And so I took it to my office, hustled to my office, ripped it open like it was Christmas. And Richard, inside of that box was every playbook, every clinic note, every handwritten thing he'd ever done in his career. It was his career in a box, right? Wow. All the way back to his head coaching days at UCLA, then on to the Eagles, and taking a moribund Eagles franchise to the Super Bowl, and all his playbook, everything, right? And so all he had in there was a little note, to me, and at the end of the note he said, make sure you pass this on, right? And so that's why I do what I do with young coaches today. Is it's an opportunity to pass on the Vermeilisms that have served me so well for 40-some years.
I was just going to say, you've mentioned Dick Vermeil, a legendary coach in the National Football League on a couple of occasions there, shared that story. How much do you take from the coaches you've worked with? And out of them all, who stands out? Would it be Dick Vermeil?
Well, I think, I've been so blessed to have been around great people my whole career, whether it was as a player. Coach Bicknell, again, was a unique individual. He was, he went to Boston College, had a Heisman Trophy winner named Doug Flutie. He became the toast of the coaching world. His two boys, Bob and Jackie, were longtime NFL assistants. I actually worked for Jackie for 1 year. And on that little I was at the University of Maine. It wasn't the University of Michigan. It was the University of Maine. And, we had 4 assistant coaches off that staff went to become NFL coaches. So I've always been around really, really good people. I think about some of the guys that really made an impression on me. Buddy Ryan, certainly. Rob and Rex Ryan, who I'm very close to. Dennis Thurman, who's coaching with us here, played 9 years with the Cowboys and was defensive coordinator with the Jets and the Bills and won a Super Bowl when he was coaching Dion and Ed Reed. And, and I'm not name dropping, but there've just been so many. And really, you think about it, every interaction that you have with another human being, particularly in the coaching business, really can serve a couple of I guess, purposes, if you will. Number one, you're going to learn something, right? It may be a drill, it may be an approach, it may be a style, there's always something you can gain. And maybe it's an affirmation, just an affirmation of the things that you do, right? But that information exchange is so critical for growth. And growth as a human being really should never stop, in my opinion, right? So if I'm not growing in my business, if I'm not growing in my profession, if I'm not growing in my marriage, if I'm not growing in my fatherhood or whatever it is, then I'm not holding up my end of the bargain, right? And so, I know you understand that innately because I've worked with you, and I know how important it was for you to do a great job, as you always did, when we were at a Super Bowl and you had an interview to do, or a commentary to send back, or to do Sky Sports News. You weren't just punching a clock. You were trying to perfect your craft, and that's one of the reasons I have great respect for you. And those kinds of people are the kind of people that make my heart beat. They push you on.
It's very kind of you to say so, and obviously it goes without saying, given the relationship we've had over the last decade or so, it works both ways. Given what you've just said as well, professionally, what is it that separates the good coaches from the great ones? Because you've worked with some great coaches. What separates them from the rest of the pack?
Every single one of them and they all had different styles, right? But every single one of them that I think, and again, this is I'm the judge and jury right here, so I'm going to give you my impression.
You always do.
The number one thing that all of those guys had, Richard, was they were great communicators, right? They were great teachers, right? It's one thing to have the technical knowledge. It's another thing to be able to impart that technical knowledge and inspire the student to learn, right? And that's what the first guy that really did that to me was my father. Actually, I remember watching him as a small boy work with professional baseball players. And to this day, I say this a lot, and I'm not saying it because he's my dad. I'm saying it because I really believe it's true. My father was one of the best teaching coaches I ever saw. When you talk about being able to break a skill down and then impart that skill to an athlete, I mean, he was phenomenal. I'll go back to the late 60s when I was a little kid, 10-year-old kid. And my father at that time, he was coaching high school baseball. And he would have music at practice. Now, that was in the 60s. That was completely out there, right? And now I laugh because everywhere you go, there's music playing while guys are practicing. But what he innately knew was that when you play, and this is really phenomenal, I think, right? And I asked him why later on in his life, right? And I said, Dad, what was it that inspired you to use music in the 60s when nobody else was doing that, when it was like a more militaristic practice, right? And he said, Jeff, because what I saw was music makes people move, right? Mm-hmm. And what are we trying to do as coaches with athletes? It's every athletic event is a movement game, right? So what he was using the music for was to relax the player and get the player into the flow of what practice was. And I mean, that's ingenious to me. I mean, and I think it's
something
been
simple,
validated.
isn't it? But it's ahead of its time.
Yeah, well, way. I mean, you're talking about decades ahead of its time, and but he somehow figured that out, and he told me that he figured it out by watching kids shooting baskets in the gym, and they had this was back before there was even boom boxes, but they had a transistor radio playing while they kind of moved to the beat of the music that was playing. And that's where he saw that. And he said, I need to incorporate that in our practices. And I said, wow. I mean, that's out there.
Well, listen, we're almost out of time, Jeff, but for any coaches, up-and-coming coaches that are either watching this on our YouTube channel or listening via the podcast, whether you work in a gym, out there on the field, in a classroom with athletes, from your experience, what is the one piece of advice that you would pass on that helps make athletes better, realize their potential if they can?
I would go back to something that Coach Vermeil said to us in Kansas City when I worked with him in Kansas City, and I think it's the most profound slogan I've ever heard. And I go back every year, Richard, and there were about 12 or 15 lessons that he taught in his coach's manual, right? And one of the ones, maybe the first one, and this is the one that struck me the biggest, was players don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And if you think about that, if you want an athlete to grow, to get better, to succeed, to maximize their God-given talents, you have to tap into them. You have to invest in them. You have to reach them. And that was, the other thing he said, you must reach before you can teach, right? And sometimes we get so caught up in our own ego and our own, I'm going to go in there and I'm going to show them kind of deal. And, no, it's a journey of discovery, right? And what you hope you're able to do is inspire them enough that they'll take those steps to learn on their journey, right? Where the game becomes their passion, the game becomes their joy, right? And it's not, you don't beat them down with information, right? I think that's the biggest thing, is that you watched how incredibly positive he was. Very tough on, the practices were long, hard, grinding practices. And he was a stickler for doing things correctly and all that stuff, but he never compromised his love of his players, and his players loved him back. And that's when the magic comes. That's when you get really the special environment. Watch Dan Quinn and the Redskins, because you can see a team that truly loves each other. And that is when it's magical. Because the Redskins, I'm the Commanders, excuse me, I'm dating myself, but the Commanders certainly are not one of the four most talented teams in the NFL. But they have something, they have captured lightning in a bottle. And I think that lightning in a bottle is not a scheme, it's a love of one another.
Yeah, absolutely. Jeff, it's always a pleasure. I really appreciate your time, because I know it's early over there in Hawaii, and you'll be back on that practice field as soon as we finish here. For people who want to follow you, where can they find you on social media?
Well, you can find me at Jeff_Reinebold on Twitter. I'm on Instagram, all of those things. We do a weekly podcast on Pro Football Ireland network of podcasts. Obviously, Richard, and I would throw this out there, again, I feel it as in Hawaii, we say kuleana. That means that's my sacred duty to help young coaches. And if there are young coaches out there that if you mention that you heard this podcast and the Richard Graves, just drop Richard's name and I'll be sure and reach back to you and again, because I think we all have a responsibility to each other to help each other grow.
Yeah, for sure. Listen, thanks for your time, Jeff.
Love you, man. Take care of yourself.
Unlocking sports science to push the limits of human potential. This is the Science for Sport podcast.
Huge thanks to Coach Jeff Reinebold for joining us on this edition of the Science for Sport podcast. And if you want to find out more about coaching and coaching methods, then you can do so by going to our website, www.scienceforsports.com. And if you've enjoyed this episode, then please help us share it with a coach, a colleague, an athlete, or a friend. Remember, the more downloads we can get, the easier it is for us to attract top-name athletes or experts at the very cutting edge of their profession. Well, that's just about it from me for this edition. I look forward to talking to you again the next time we have another episode of the Science for Sport podcast.
Subscribe to the Science for Sport podcast now, wherever you listen to your podcasts. For more insights, resources, and to join the Academy, visit scienceforsports.com and connect with us on social media by searching for @ScienceForSport. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.